He once threw an entire party, at his own expense, for an employee he'd known for exactly 1 week, just to be invited to stay a little longer at the end of the night. Not because he was generous, because being asked to leave a room, any room, felt to Michael Scott like being erased. Michael didn't need to be liked. He needed proof he still existed. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to know every cringe-inducing pause by heart, and for years I laughed at Michael the same way everyone does. But you don't just see an oblivious boss who never knows when to stop talking. You see a man who spent his entire adult life terrified of being left out of the room, built by a childhood that taught him love had to be won every single day from everyone. By the end of this video, every uncomfortable joke he's ever made and every party he's ever thrown is going to sound like something else entirely. There's a term for what Michael does. Psychologists call it anxious attachment. People with this pattern don't just want connection. They chase it constantly, scanning every room for signs that it might be slipping away. They overgive, overshare, and overreact to any hint of distance, because somewhere early on they learned that love could disappear without warning, and that the only defense was to never stop performing for it. Michael doesn't just want to be liked. He needs it, the way other people need air, and he has built his entire adult personality around making sure the supply never runs out. Michael's dislike of Toby isn't really about anything Toby does. Toby is calm, fair, and largely harmless, and yet Michael treats his presence like a personal betrayal, year after year, episode after episode, in a way that goes well beyond ordinary office friction. Look closer, and the pattern makes sense. Toby is HR. His job, by definition, is to hold Michael accountable, to say no, to document mistakes instead of laughing them off. For someone whose entire identity depends on being universally adored, a person whose role is literally to point out his failures isn't just annoying. He's a walking threat to the one thing Michael cannot survive without: everyone's approval, all the time, with no paperwork attached. So Michael doesn't process Toby as a coworker. He processes him as proof that someone, somewhere, might not love him back. That idea gets considerably more painful once you see exactly who Michael let get closest. Michael's relationship with Jan looks, on the surface, like a mismatched romance played mostly for laughs. But watch how hard Michael works, throughout, to keep her from leaving. The gifts, the apologies for things that weren't his fault, the willingness to absorb blame just to keep the relationship technically intact. This is classic anxious attachment behavior. When the fear of abandonment gets loud enough, people will accept almost any treatment just to avoid being alone with it. Michael isn't staying with Jan because the relationship is healthy. He's staying because leaving would confirm his deepest fear that he isn't worth staying for in the first place. It's a pattern that costs him more than he ever seems to notice in the moment. And it isn't until someone treats him differently that the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Holly is the first person in the entire series who seems to like Michael without needing to manage him. She laughs at his jokes because she genuinely finds them funny, not because she's performing polite tolerance. For someone who has spent his whole life monitoring rooms for signs of rejection, that kind of ease is almost disorienting to receive. Michael doesn't just fall for Holly. He visibly relaxes around her in a way he never does with anyone else in the office. The anxious scanning quiets down. The desperate bits land less often because he doesn't need them to land anymore. For the first time on screen, he isn't performing to be loved. He's simply being seen without having to earn it first. That contrast says everything about what Michael had been missing for years. It makes what comes next, at the office itself, considerably harder to watch. The Scott's Tot storyline is, on its face, one of Michael's most disastrous decisions, promising college tuition to a group of students years earlier without any real way to pay for it. Watched purely as comedy, it's excruciating. Watched through the lens of his fear, it's devastating. Michael didn't make that promise to help the students. He made it to be loved by them, instantly and completely, in a single moment that made him feel important beyond measure. The years later consequence, having to face them with nothing to give, isn't just embarrassing. It's Michael's worst fear realized in real time, a room full of people who trusted him, watching that trust collapse in front of him. He'd rather have made almost any promise than risk not being adored in that specific moment. That same instinct shows up, in smaller ways, with nearly everyone who ever passes through that office. The show gives us only glimpses of Michael's early years, but they matter enormously. He grew up largely in front of a television and has spoken about his mother's remarriage to a man named Jeffrey, someone Michael has described feeling overlooked by, even unwanted by, inside his own home. For a child who felt like an afterthought once, adulthood becomes a long, exhausting campaign to make sure it never happens again. Every party, every joke, every desperate bid for a room's attention traces back to that same quiet fear. If I stop trying, I'll disappear the way I did back then. That fear followed him into every office he ever worked in, long before Dunder Mifflin and long before anyone was filming him trying to manage it. Michael's fixation on Ryan Howard, a temp he barely knew before deciding Ryan was destined for greatness, looks at first like simple fulveratism, but the intensity of it reveals something more specific. Michael doesn't just like Ryan. He needs Ryan to succeed, publicly and spectacularly, as if Ryan's rise could somehow retroactively prove that Michael's own judgment and his own worth were real all along. When Ryan is later promoted above Michael, Michael doesn't respond with ordinary professional jealousy. He responds like someone whose own reflection just turned around and left the room. He had built part of his identity on being the man who discovered Ryan, and losing that role cost him something closer to a parent's grief than a manager's disappointment. It's a smaller storyline than Jan or Holly, but it shows the same architecture underneath. Michael doesn't just form relationships. He builds his sense of self out of them, one borrowed reflection at a time. Long before Dunder Mifflin, Michael worked under a regional manager named Ed Truck, a boss Michael has described more than once in almost reverent terms. It's a brief detail in the show's history, easy to miss, but it tells us something crucial. Michael's entire management style wasn't invented in a vacuum. It was built as tribute to a father figure he'd found in the workplace, because he hadn't reliably found one anywhere else. Every ill-advised joke, every insistence on being a friend first, boss second, traces back to a template Michael inherited from a man who apparently made him feel valued once, in an environment where almost nothing else had. He wasn't just trying to run an office. He was trying to recreate the one relationship that had ever made him feel like he belonged somewhere, using the only blueprint he'd ever been given. That inherited blueprint explains a great deal about why Michael clings so hard to being liked at work specifically, rather than anywhere else in his life, and it connects directly to a workplace culture that, at the time, was quietly rewarding exactly this kind of behavior. To understand Michael fully, it helps to understand the specific workplace culture he came up in. The early 2000s saw a shift in American office management ideals away from the distant, authoritative boss of earlier decades toward a newer model, the boss who was also, supposedly, your friend. Team-building exercises, casual Fridays, bosses who wanted to be seen as relatable rather than merely respected. Michael absorbed that shift more literally and more desperately than the culture ever intended. Where other managers treated friend first as a talking point, Michael treated it as his entire identity, because being liked wasn't a management strategy for him. It was the only currency he'd ever fully trusted. The culture around him didn't invent his need for approval, but it did hand him a professional excuse to indulge it constantly in front of an audience without ever having to examine why. That cultural permission is part of why Michael's specific brand of neediness could hide for so long behind the label of eccentric boss instead of being recognized as something considerably more personal. There's a second layer of context worth examining. Michael grew up watching enormous amounts of television at a time when American sitcoms were increasingly selling a very specific fantasy that charisma and humor could make anyone the most important person in any room. For a boy getting limited warmth at home, that fantasy wasn't just entertainment. It was a survival manual. Television taught Michael that being funny was a currency that worked when almost nothing else did. It didn't require a parent's attention or a stepfather's approval. It just required an audience, any audience, willing to laugh. That lesson became the architecture of his entire adult personality, decades before a documentary crew ever pointed a camera at him and gave him the audience he'd always been quietly auditioning for. It's not a coincidence that the show itself is structured as a documentary. Michael spent his whole life performing for an audience that mostly wasn't there. The show finally gave him one, real cameras, real attention, and it's part of why he responds to it the way he does. Michael's role in Jim and Pam's relationship is mostly comic relief on the surface, an oblivious boss stumbling through other people's romance. But watch how Michael actually behaves around them once real intimacy starts to form. He gets quieter, almost wistful. Occasionally, uncharacteristically, he steps back instead of inserting himself into the moment. That restraint matters. Jim and Pam represent something Michael has never once managed to build. An easy, unforced closeness that doesn't require constant performance to maintain. Watching it happen in front of him, without needing his approval or his jokes to validate it, seems to quietly remind Michael of exactly what he's been missing, and exactly how hard he's had to work to get even a fraction of that ease with anyone. It's one of the only relationships in the show where Michael isn't trying to be the center of attention, and that absence says more about his loneliness than almost any joke he ever makes on camera. Andy Bernard arrives at Dunder Mifflin as, in many ways, a distorted mirror of Michael himself. Desperate to be liked, quick to overshare, prone to grand romantic gestures that land badly. Michael's reaction to him is telling. He doesn't recognize the resemblance. He mostly finds Andy exhausting, even as he does versions of the exact same things himself, week after week. That blind spot is the point. It's far easier to see a need for approval in someone else than to recognize it in the mirror. Michael spends years mildly tormenting a man who is, underneath the specific quirks, running the same emotional program he is. Neither of them ever quite says so out loud. It's a quiet, almost accidental piece of self-portraiture tucked into a supporting character. Most viewers barely connect back to Michael at all, and it sets up exactly how blind Michael can be to the one relationship in the office that never actually required any of this effort from him. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Dwight Schrute, the one everyone frames as Michael's exhausting, overzealous subordinate, competing endlessly for approval he'll never fully get, he's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, the only person in that entire office who never needed Michael to perform for him at all. Think about it. Every other relationship in Michael's life runs on a transaction. Be entertaining enough, generous enough, present enough, and you'll be loved. But Dwight admires Michael before the jokes land, before the gifts, before any of the performance even starts. Dwight's loyalty isn't earned through effort. It's just there, unconditionally, in a way nothing else in Michael's life has ever been offered to him. So the man Michael spends years mildly tormenting for laughs turns out to be the one relationship where Michael never had to be anxious at all. He just never noticed, because it didn't arrive, wrapped in the chaos he'd spent his whole life mistaking for love. What Michael deserved, back in that house with the television and the stepfather who barely looked at him, was someone to simply want him around. Not because he was funny, not because he gave gifts or threw parties, or made himself impossible to ignore in every room he entered. Just because he was there. What he actually received was silence, and a lesson he never fully unlearned, that love has to be won every single day from everyone, or it quietly disappears. He built an entire personality, and later an entire office, to make sure the room never emptied out again. He built it so well, he almost never let himself rest inside it. And when Holly finally looked at him and simply liked what she saw, no performance required, no audience necessary, that was the boy in front of the television, finally, quietly, exhaling. The parties were never about the parties. They never were. So was Michael Scott a terrible boss, or a big heart in the wrong job? Neither, honestly. Michael wasn't a bad manager who happened to be kind-hearted, and he wasn't a kind man who happened to be bad at his job. He was a person who turned an entire workplace into the family he was afraid he'd never have, because it was the only stage his era, his television set, and his childhood ever taught him how to build. Maybe that's truer of more bosses, more friends, more people we know than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person trying hardest to make everyone laugh is the one most afraid of what happens in the silence. So here's what I want to know. If Michael had grown up in a house where he never had to compete for attention, and in an era that didn't sell him charisma as the only currency worth having, do you think he still becomes the guy who needs the whole office to love him? Or was that need always going to find him somewhere? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.